Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here, and today I want to chat with you guys a little bit about why I and almost all of my lifters, why we use the box squat combined with the good morning as our foundational lower body exercises, and to some extent upper body, because these both work the middle and upper back to a large extent as well. And you guys will notice when you watch my various training vlogs, because I upload every single workout every week, they're all dated, that I do a lot of maxes on box squats. I do speed work on box squats. I do some maxes with good mornings, and I do a lot of repetition work with the good morning. And if you're curious what a lot of my clients do, most of my clients follow a very, very similar pattern. It's what I have my lifters do. And the reason we do this is that this combination allows us a lot of variation. It allows us a lot of rate of force production, and it has a very good stimulus to fatigue ratio goes as far as axial loading exercises. Because we need to remember the box squat has the highest rate of force production. It teaches you how to power squat, and that's a point that we need to remember. We are learning to power squat. I don't coach, teach, or really require anyone to Olympic squat. It's not something that I'm interested in. It's not something that I need. It's not something that most of you need. And I think this is something that gets lost in the translation when people start talking about squatting, because they're, well, why squat for my quads? I'm like, well, just because you use less hip and everything else doesn't mean you're using more quads. Okay? Doesn't mean you're using more quads. It means you're using the same amount of quad, but you're adding more other muscles. You know, people will always point out, well, there's a few guys who Olympic squat who compete at very high levels in powerlifting. Yeah, they're the exception. They're not the norm. And here's what I would say to a lot of people. Just because 3% of the strongest guys in the world can do something, and they're the exception to the rule, if that's what you start doing because they're the exception to the rule, right? They're the exception to the rule as far as leverages, like what they're doing as far as it being inferior for most people's leverages. If you start following the exception to that rule, don't complain when you don't get results. What I would suggest is that you do it the correct way, get to the elite level, and then maybe find out if you're the exception to the rule, because you're still going to be strong, you know. And that's what people forget. Even if you think that you're suited to do some Olympic squatting, or maybe you'll be just as strong, it's not going to hurt you to get your power squat to 500 or 550 pounds and then mess more with Olympic squatting. Okay, it's not going to hurt you. It carries over. Like, you're not going to lose anything for having done that. But if you do it the other way, I promise you're going to lose strength potential. And that's a good way to look at it. But the box squat teaches us how to power squat, and it does so in a way that's easier to recover from. It does so in a way that we can be very consistent with our depth, range of motion, everything else. Also far more suited for speed work. And we'll notice that the good morning is essentially a power squat. You know, irrespective of what stance you take, even if you do the stance I'm doing here, which is not the widest stance we could do, fairly wide, not as wide as a power squat, it's still a squat, isn't it? It's a squat with the quads removed. It's a squat with the quads removed. Before people chime in and say, well, I need more quads, it's like, well, do you see me lacking for quads there? We do other stuff for quads. Our good mornings will need to hit quads. But good mornings, as far as a hypertrophy exercise go, they bring a lot more to the table than squats. Now, some people will point out, well, Jason, the way that you do them and recommend them, you want them to be just as strong as your squats, so wouldn't your 10 rep sets and everything be really similar? Yes, they would. They would. However, they don't beat you up the same way that squats do, in my experience. To do an all-out set of 10 reps on a good morning for multiple sets does not destroy you the same way box squats do. It just doesn't. Like, in other words, if your 10 rep max on both is 315 and you do sets of 315, the squat's going to crush you more. You're going to be more beat up from it. And there's other stuff we can do for our quads. And besides, the good morning has amazing carryover. Okay, it has amazing carryover to your other lifts. It builds your posterior chain, builds your upper back, and it actually prepares you to be able to push yourself through a good morning squat in the event that it happens. They're the same exercise, and that's what people forget, and they'll argue about it because they don't understand biomechanically the joint angles are the same. The only difference is the amount of knee flexion between a squat and a good morning. Now, obviously, your individual stance matters and stuff, but as far as all the hip extension, everything else goes, they're identical. But the good morning allows you to build the posterior side better, and that's what most guys lack. Like, humans are naturally quad dominant, and a lot of people get more quad dominant with their training, and they end up lacking all the hip extension strength, and then they wonder why they can't power squat. They wonder why they can't deadlift. They wonder why they can't do anything that requires them to have hip extension or a hip hinge. Well, because you haven't developed it. Okay. It carries over. And there's a very, very strong synergy created between these two exercises, because if you can learn to good morning and you can learn to push your hips back correctly and hip hinge on a good morning, you can push your hips back correctly on a power squat. Okay? It will train you how to do it, and it'll train you how to box squat. Because that's one of the biggest issues I run into with a lot of newer clients, is that they struggle to sit back on the squat. They struggle to sit back on the squat because they don't know how to hip hinge. And I think what people forget too when we start talking about the hinge versus squat, it's not an either or, it's a sliding scale, it's a continuum. Like, think of it as a continuum line. On one end represents a hip hinge, on the other end represents a squat. All these movements are somewhere in between. Deadlifts actually of various types fit into that spectrum also, and we can classify them versus how squatty versus how hingy they are. It's all a continuum. And when you understand that, it makes sense why certain things carry over better. It makes sense why the good morning carries over both directions, because it's in the middle there, although it is really a hip hinge. Okay? It carries over because your other movements tend to be a mixture. The only ones that are a pure squat would be like if you're doing a straight up full Olympic squat. That would represent one end of the spectrum, right? And a straight leg good morning or Romanian deadlift would represent the other end. But it's all a spectrum in between, and all your other squats and pulls are somewhere on that sliding scale. Okay. And the good morning tends to shore up all the weak links involved with any of it. And it teaches you how to turn your squatty movements into more hingy movements. It teaches you how to push your hips back and get more muscles involved. And then it builds those extra muscles that are actually involved, so that you'll automatically be good at it when you do it. All right, guys, but that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I will talk to you guys next time.